This recording is going to explore an esri story map, and we're actually going to look at two story maps. So the background for this is the map of biodiversity importance and overview, and there is a recording that goes before watching this one, and it explains what NatureServe is, and it is giving an overview of this recently published set of data that is a map of biodiversity importance. And so I'm just going to give just a quick review, and I'm going to focus on the data sets that were used in the creation of this collection of maps. And this is showing areas of the world where brighter colors are indicating areas that are in greater need of conservation efforts. And so it is based on the idea that these bright areas that you see on the map indicate where there are multiple imperiled species that are co-occurring, and they are not already safeguarded by our current protected areas. And this is for looking into the future and for conservation planning. And it is based on the idea that there are some areas that if they are preserved, they will contribute more to diversity or biodiversity than other areas. And so not all ecosystems are equal in terms of their biodiversity, in terms of number of species, and the health of the ecosystem and how it contributes to larger systems at a whole. And so in this background story map, and again, I am scrolling through rather quickly. I hope that you go back and explore this on your own. I want to just jump to, this was the model that we used to use. This is based on a heat map analysis, and you can see that there are hot spots that were identified around the United States. And this was created in 2013, and it gave us a good sense for areas that were containing imperiled species and areas that were at risk for species hotspots in locations that we had been able to survey. But we can't survey everywhere. And so this new data set is looking at modeling and a predictive analysis of the entire coverage of the United States based on multiple inputs of data sets that we do have coverage for. And it takes into account species home ranges, it takes into account other types of data sets that we are going to explore in detail. And so this is where I wanted to get to. Again, please explore the rest of this story map in my other recording that introduces the entire contents of it. But for this particular video, I want to look into the background and the recipe for better biodiversity mapping. So you might be wondering, how did they make that map with those colors? And how do they know where the areas should be showing up as bright spots? So NatureServe works with hundreds of scientists, and the network collects, curates, and shares authoritative data on species at risk, endangered, threatened, and all types of species that exist in the United States. And so you can see these are the most imperiled and critically imperiled species as collected by data from the NatureServe network. And we can zoom in on this map, and we can look at the different representations around the United States. So you can see that there are large gaps in this type of data set. And so when we look at the building of a data set, this is how the one that you're looking at in particular is constructed. And so if we take a representative reptile, this is the Escambia map turtle, and it is classified as a G2, which is imperiled. And this is the scientific classification that you can see down here. This map inset is showing you areas where this turtle is utilizing land for its home ranges. And so it is mapping out different statuses of different species, but this one is focusing just on the Escambia map turtle, and we can see that all of Florida and then parts of Alabama will be considered home to this type of turtle. So the scientists collect data on the animals' habits and ecological needs, and then they create these data sets not of just where the animals have been found, but where they could potentially survive and exist. Because one of the things about human development and the expansion of urban areas is that many of these natural habitats are being replaced with man-made settlements. And so it's important when we look at expanding our human population to understand the home ranges and the potential areas that could support the survival of a species. And so if we wanted to look, for instance, again at this turtle, any of these areas that you see in orange would be suitable for this type of turtle. And again, we can't survey everywhere, so there are gaps in the data. This is showing you that there needs to be a model, and an interpolated surface can certainly help us to understand better which areas are important and how they rank in terms of conservation. So here is an example of one of those interpolated surfaces. We don't sample at every point in the United States, or the scientists don't. Most of my sampling was done in oceanic environments. And this is a terrestrial example, and it's showing you count of species according to color. So where you see the bright yellows, you have a higher number of species existing in those ecological areas and those ecosystems. The darker areas would represent fewer number of species that live in that area, and it's not the total diversity of the system, it is the species that are considered to be imperiled. So we are just in this data set looking at species that are at risk of extinction. The idea being that as we approach conservation management, endangered species are giving us clues about the ecosystems that are the most impacted. Usually they're impacted by climate change. They're also impacted by urban development and other types of human activity. So again, this is an interpolated surface. It was not based on data collected at every square kilometer of the United States, but it is a model that says this is where these species could occur, and overlapping the ranges like the one we saw for the turtle in Florida, overlapping the ranges of different endangered species, and then seeing, for instance, this area of California right here in yellow would have 10 or 11 or more species that used this as an ecosystem or as a home, and they are considered to be imperiled. Now, it doesn't mean that there's only 10 species in that area. There could be hundreds. There probably are. So this is an example of a salamander, and salamanders are amphibious. They rely on water for some of their life cycle, and they utilize terrestrial resources for another part of their water cycle. And amphibians are particularly vulnerable to changes in the ecosystem. So the endangerment of amphibians, having them placed on the endangered list or being threatened or described in other categories as being imperiled or in need of conservation help, is a signal that the ecosystem is not healthy. And they're one of the first species that will provide that kind of information. So you might have heard about the canary in the coal mine. We have species such as the Jollyville Plateau salamander here that has very sensitive ecological requirements. If the area that this salamander is inhabiting changes, it will show effects of that very quickly. Okay, so if we want to think about a recipe for biodiversity mapping, the first ingredient is that we add verified field data. So now the areas that we're looking at in green were areas where actual sampling did take place. So you can see that this is quite an extensive network of scientists that are contributing to these data models. And as we zoom in to this Jollyville Plateau salamander's home ranges, you can see that there are discrete patches of areas that can support that salamander. The next step in our recipe, or the second ingredient, is environmental predictors. One of the environmental needs is a particular type of soil pH. And some animals are very sensitive to a change in the soil pH. Some require acidic environments and some require basic environments. So with regards to our salamander, these are the soil pH rankings that can support this salamander. And so we're looking at what I should say is these are the ranges of soil pHs in the United States, and this is a factor in the habitat that is suitable for the salamander. And so if you know that your salamander needs higher or acidic environments, the blues and the starting to get into the light yellows, that's one factor that makes a habitat potentially useful for that salamander. Now, there's a complex set of environmental interactions, and luckily with the GIS, we can add several different kinds of data to our model. This is the second data set in the model, and it is looking at the distribution of coniferous forest cover. So the salamanders require a riparian environment, which is streams and edges of water, and these types of streams and areas need to be included in a coniferous forest cover for the protection of the canopy and the vegetation above those stream systems. And so our salamander, even if the pH was correct along a stream system in central part of the United States, if there were no coniferous forest cover, that salamander could not survive. And so this is really key when we think about the idea of animals being displaced and moving to other locations. Most of the time, they cannot. There are some animals that are very hardy and will migrate and survive in different kinds of ecosystems, but all animals do have an ecological niche. So part of the niche or the requirement for our salamander is forest cover. Another important factor that was put into the model for the salamander is the distance to woody wetlands. So this salamander, as an amphibian, can only be so far away from water, continuous water. It cannot live in areas where the water is seasonal or perennial and dries up. It must stay within a certain number of meters of a continuous and reliable water source, and this has to be a woody wetland. And so we are looking at the distribution of how far is the land area that we're considering away from a woody wetland in this data set. And so the areas that are further away from the woody wetlands are shown in the reds, and the areas that are closer to woody wetlands, maybe in fact right on the top of them, are shown in blues. And so it's easy to imagine here, if we look at the Mississippi River Delta, that there's a lot of blue areas. So there's a lot of woody wetlands that you would find in this area as well. A great distribution of woody wetland on the East Coast. Not so many in the desert areas of Arizona and Nevada, and that makes sense to us. Also, if you want to interpret this data set, you'll notice that in the middle of one of the Great Lakes, there is a great distance to a woody wetland. So even though we have woody wetlands over here, distance to that woody wetland would not be acceptable for our salamander. It needs to have land and water as part of its requirement. Another data set that is very important is a range of temperatures. And so this map is showing you mean summer temperatures, and the redder areas are warmer, and then the bluer areas are cooler. And so amphibians are reliant upon external temperatures for thermoregulation. They're not really cold-blooded. They're more considered to be exotherms. But the common term might be that you've heard before is cold-blooded. But the whole idea is that they cannot exist in cooler environments. They do not produce their own body heat from food energy like mammals and birds do. And so they need to have a certain very narrow range of summer temperatures and can't be extremely hot. So for instance, the salamander would probably, even if there was a water source available to it, and canopy cover, which there's not a lot in Arizona, but there is some in California. And the mean summer temperature is a limiting factor and another data set that is important to consider. And here we see in data from the Environmental Protection Agency that hydrologic connectivity is also important. And so the areas in the greens are more suitable for our salamander than the areas in the purples. And that's because they rely on a stream network for their survival. That has a lot to do with their breeding habits, and they lay their eggs in water, and also the food that they rely on needs to have a strong hydrological stream system. And those factors all contribute to give us that interpolated layer that we saw earlier. Step 3, you take all of this data and you mix it at high speed with machine learning. So this may be your cup of tea. You might be very interested in coding and programming. And this is an example of some scripting that takes all of these factors and it says, create a model for me of the areas that are ideal and have the best suitability for our salamander. So you take those data sets, you define your parameters, and then you have machine learning tell you, okay, we're going to find areas where not only is the summer temperature correct, the pH of the soil is ideal, or within the range that you've set for me. We have enough percent woody tree cover, and we have a strong hydrological stream system, which is defined within the attributes of that data set. So step 4, you can sample your creation and adjust your seasonings as needed. And so what you can do is you can analyze these graphs and look at the results of how is the model responding to the data inputs that you have chosen and that you studied, and you can adjust it as needed. And so you might, for instance, adjust the slopes that you define as being acceptable, or you might widen your range of acceptable slope values shown in degrees here on the side of the graph, or you might narrow it. You might look at things like impervious cover, you might look at shrub cover and open cover and distance to carbonate, residual materials. So if you'll notice, these data sets are ones that were not shown in the final model. And it's when you start building a model, you can consider many different aspects of habitat usage by that species. And then as you refine your model, you will filter it down and determine which of those habitats are critical. And so in our example, the slope was not nearly as important as distance to woody vegetation, and it wasn't as important as high summer temperatures, for example. Again, more statistical analysis that you can run, and you can look at accuracy, and this is looking at false positive rates, and you can set a cutoff for your models and say, I want to deal with a certain amount of uncertainty, and I don't want the model to include anything that is more uncertain than my threshold. All right, so again, this is a summary of a very, very complex procedure, and we're simplifying it here, but certainly it's taken many, many years, or I'm sure hundreds of thousands of hours, hundreds of scientists, and a lot of testing and input in order to come up with this species distribution model. I want you to focus in here on figure 2. It's showing relative importance of environmental variables. So this is a list of all of the variables that are considered in the life cycle of that salamander. And so we know that things like the temperature and the woody cover and the pH that we see here ended up being very key parts. The deciduous forest cover ended up being very key parts in the model of our salamander. And then finally, after you have let your machine do the deeper learning and the deeper analysis, it will come back and it will provide you with a raster. And this raster is saying that the areas that you see in yellow have the highest probability of being a suitable habitat, which means those salamanders would have the greatest survival, and they would be ideally suited for these areas that you see in yellow. They would not be suited for areas that you see in red. There's a very low probability that they could select that as an ideal habitat. So notice that this is not the same thing as where have we found the species. That is an occurrence type of data set. This is a predictive model, and it is an interpolated surface, a raster of looking at a combination of all the factors we've talked about. Where would this salamander be the most successful? And so any good cook knows that you should give others a taste of your recipe. And so you want to share your results with the greater community at large. And it's going to, excuse me while I scroll, it's not working right now, the link, but this was where it was going to take us into a map of biodiversity importance. And so combining our information on our salamander with some other species, we can then get similar kinds of deep learning and predictive modeling, looking now at the combination of habitat suitability for many different types of organisms. Okay, and then finally, you repeat this process for using as much information as you have and putting into your models imperiled species. And so what NatureServe has done is looked at 2,216 of the nation's most imperiled species in making this data set that we've explored here in this story map. I encourage you to explore this story map on your own, play around with the data set and look at areas that are interesting to you, and the link will be provided for you. Thank you very much for your attention.